Hello and welcome to yet another episode of The Extreme Exchange, the third season, second episode. This time it features two of my friends from BMT, Xavier and Tim. And today we talk about things like death, mortality, the afterlife, and meaning, what it means to have a meaningful life, and just what the definition of meaning is in general. Unfortunately, the video got messed up, so this episode is only going to have audio. Nonetheless, I found our conversation extremely insightful and interesting. I hope you enjoy. We're talking about death today, mortality more specifically, and what to do in spite of it. And I know that it's slightly religious in nature, although not fully, which is, afterlife is always religious lah. But I'm happy to discuss other types of afterlives, and I always like to say that it has nothing to do with what you actually believe or not. You can discuss concepts regardless of what your actual beliefs are. So, yeah, mortality affects everybody. Everybody has to die someday. I just want to start by saying, does it scare you guys? Like death itself. Assume there's no afterlife or whatever.
I think I'm at peace with the idea of death. But I also think that being scared of death comes with realizing what your purpose is in life. I think the real fear with death comes from things unaccomplished and what you weren't able to do in life and potential regrets. And I don't think I'm at a point yet where I know so firmly what I want to do and want to accomplish in my time on Earth that I'd be remorseful if I wasn't able to accomplish it.
So it's more like you don't really know what you would have lost.
Yeah.
But that's not the idea of like the fact that there is potential at all. Even if you don't really know what the potential is, the fact that there is lost potential.
So like the fear of the potential itself being lost.
Correct.
That's terrifying in itself, isn't it?
Yeah, at least for me lah. I share a similar sentiment to you about not knowing what I could have lost, but at the same time, it's like the fact that you're losing something is still, yeah.
I think that's also contingent on the question as to whether or not, there is an inherent meaning to what you're doing, right? Like, I don't know, I frequently fluctuate between the notion that there must be some grand ideal that your life's aspiring towards, and the converse that, a good life is just living, right, and enjoying the moment.
Yeah, I think you can spend some time on what a good life looks like. So let's say we have a finite amount of time on Earth, and you can do whatever you want in this life, right? What would you say is tantamount to a good life?
Okay, have you heard of something called the pleasure principle?
Not really. Can
You've heard of the
elaborate?
pleasure principle?
What, so the inverse of the harm principle?
No, it's like how to explain this? It's the idea that meaningful life can be based. Okay, I don't think I'm saying it correctly, but it's like the idea that the pursuit of a meaningful life is based on the pursuit of pleasure itself.
So
it doesn't matter if
hedonism.
it's hedonistic or like pure love, but it's the pursuit of pleasure itself.
And you can define pleasure as anything that is.
That
feels good.
Yeah, it feels
So
good.
I guess it's the utilitarian problem, right? You're using a utilitarian metric to quantify what a good life is. It maximizes pleasure, but there's
maximize
always
pleasure, minimize pain.
maximize pleasure, minimize pain, but it lacks the qualitative aspect to say what is pleasure.
Yeah, but then what would be like a different perspective to that then? Like, if your goal isn't to maximize pleasure, minimize pain, what could a different goal possibly be? Okay, maximize pain, minimize pleasure, although it's an option, I don't think anybody would.
It's the most
pursue that,
logical
yeah.
point of the path for this is least resistance, right?
Correct. And anyway, you could always argue that if you're pursuing pain instead of pleasure, you actually derive
You take pleasure in
yeah,
pain.
correct.
You're just
So
a masochist.
at the end of the day, it's still
Then it's
pleasure.
not pain anymore. It's just pleasure, isn't it?
Correct.
Yeah.
So I would suggest that maybe an alternative lifestyle would be duty, maybe. So some things are not pleasurable, but people still pursue. Yeah.
Duty.
What do you
Like
think?
duty to your country.
Like duty in itself.
Yeah, maybe like duty, maybe your country, to your family. I mean, some people would lead a life of strife just to make sure that other people's lives are better.
Because people like attach purpose and meaning into objects of other people, and they derive meaning from the actions they do for them, others, or like for the items they wish to acquire, be it power or like the love for their loved ones. I think those are like what drives most people in that sense.
So the principle it boils down to then is, in essence, a life well lived is the life where you have most impact on whatever you think you have an obligation to or a duty to. So the life where you help others most in a certain aspect to whomever you think you have a duty to or some kind of moral obligation to.
Okay, actually you raised impact, which I realize is you can live a pleasurable life but have no impact on the world. So like you could live your whole life in a basement where maybe you're hooked up to a pleasure machine, for example.
The Matrix lah.
Yeah, but you've never made a real impact on society or something like that. Yeah, then whereas maybe on the flip side you made a huge impact but didn't get to enjoy as many things as you could have. Yeah, I would think, I actually think that people working in like parliament and government service, they are to some extent doing that because it means that their own personal goals in life, maybe they could be like billionaires, okay, they could be very successful people outside.
Well, you have to remember in Singapore they are millionaires.
Yeah, that's
They are already millionaires.
Okay, let's not talk about money. Maybe they could be like inventors or something like that. Pursue their own dreams, essentially. But instead they choose to dedicate and devote their life to.
So Lee Hsien Loong wanted to be a mathematician.
Really?
Yeah, he got first in Cambridge math,
Wow, that's.
and then he became an RT officer.
Calculate trajectory though. Yeah. I don't know. Okay, so I mean, would you say that it's similar to the idea of carpe diem? So like seizing the day essentially. So we can talk about meaningful life. We can also talk about meaningful day, and I think this is relevant because the fact that nobody knows when they're gonna die means that tomorrow could be your last day, and that means that you would want to live today as if tomorrow was your last day, lah, right? So I don't know. Does it apply to a meaningful day? You think?
I think, okay, I've always thought of carpe diem with like, have you heard of Nietzsche's idea of lightness and heaviness?
No.
So, okay, I think Nietzsche didn't coin the idea of lightness, but it was in a book I've recently read. Have you read The Unbearable Lightness of Being?
No.
So essentially, it has this dichotomy between lightness or heaviness, and there are these abstract philosophical notions. Nietzsche coins this idea of heaviness, where it's this idea of eternal return. Imagine if lives were infinite as a thought experiment, not actual reincarnation, even though there's some philosophical debate on whether eternal return really exists.
Wait, so you mean like immortality, right?
No, immortality, meaning things happen cyclically. You kept
Right.
repeating the same life.
Oh, okay.
You kept repeating the same choices. The problem with history and actions that are already done are that you can't isolate what you change, right? You can't isolate variables. But imagine that you could repeat every single day. Imagine like as if it were like Groundhog Day. Have you watched Groundhog Day?
Yeah, I know what it is.
So in essence, it's like Groundhog Day, and Nietzsche coined this thought experiment in the gay science, right? And he's like, okay, so what would happen if you relived your life innumerable times? Would it bring you immense joy, or the most soul-crushing emptiness?
Would you remember
Most-
every life,
yeah.
every cycle?
Or the most soul-crushing emptiness that you could ever experience?
But you'd be locked
right?
into carrying out every single decision you've made in every past life.
Yeah, I don't think the mental fatigue of doing that's the consideration. It's
Maybe like more of how would you feel having to watch your life over and over again?
I think what Nietzsche is getting at, right, is the weight of responsibility of making decisions over and over again. And Kundera makes this like example, so he coins the example of the French Revolution, right? So historians praise revolutions in the French Revolution because they made sacrifices and they were heroic and they overcame tyranny, right? But what if they kept repeating that? The decision to rebel and revolt and people's head in the guillotine was made over and over again. right? Would historians look on them in the same positive light? Or is the perception of them and the positive nature of what they did inherent to the fact that it was only done once? Which is the philosophical idea of lightness, where you accept a lack of ultimate meaning in life and instead live for momentary beauty, right? This idea of ephemeral beauty where you're assigned meaning because things only happen once. Your life is beautiful and meaningful because it's fleeting. Your actions in the present are meaningful because you do it once.
Are those mutually exclusive things? That
So-
you can't have one without the other, or like can they
I mean,
both exist?
it's a thought experiment, so I don't think it's speaking in practicalities.
Well, I mean, if you're thinking about applying it to our daily lives, I wouldn't think it's mutually exclusive in that sense.
What's mutually exclusive?
Like the idea that you can live your life by enjoying both the ephemeral parts and the parts that keep repeating, you know.
Okay, but I don't think repetition in life is necessarily the same thing as eternal return, because it's not identical, right? You can have a repetitive day but still live in the moment and enjoy the uniqueness of every single day. Like even though you do more or less the same thing every day in camp, right? You can still live in the moment and enjoy that you'll only be at this point in time in this place doing this exact thing once in your life, and it's beautiful because of that. And I don't know, I think that's the essence of carpe diem to me.
So if you could maybe summarize what you think carpe diem like means.
I mean, I think it's just that I think it's this idea of lightness but with its significance contrasted against heaviness. That essentially, even though there may be inherent lack of ultimate meaning within life, right? Living for the momentary beauty that the finite nature of life grants is where you derive significance from.
Okay. So the fact that it only happens once
Yeah.
gives it meaning.
So how you can never enjoy the same that sunset you just saw.
Yeah,
today.
exactly. The fact that life is finite gives it significance.
Yeah, I mean, okay, that's actually one of the alternatives to death that I didn't consider, because I brainstormed into no afterlife, the standard heaven and hell, reincarnation. But there's a fourth, which is like what you laid out just now, kind of.
But I think it's part and parcel with no afterlife. Oh, you mean like eternal return?
Yeah,
something.
the eternal return.
I think
yeah.
that's similar to
That's no afterlife in that
reincarnation.
sense. But that's not an afterlife really. What?
I
You're
don't
just
think
repeating it.
I don't think it's really an existential consideration. It's more of a thought experiment. I mean, there is an argument for eternal return. It's just that there's finite energy and finite matter within the universe, so there can only be so many combinations of the two, and with infinite time, things will inevitably repeat. Like even pi has repeating segments, right? I think that's the argument in favor of eternal return, but I don't think that's salient to the discussion.
Okay.
Actually, Ben, I'm quite curious. Why do you want to know about like all these, especially about your mortality and about the fact of whether an afterlife exists or not, how it affects people? Like, you want to find out how people abuse that knowledge and apply it to how does it influence their actions in their lives? Is that what you're aiming at?
Actually, okay, so to start off, it kind of feels more like I want to know how people react to different kinds of afterlives, because everybody has different views on what happens after they die, right? Some people think there's nothing, some people think there's heaven or hell. I mean, specifically with heaven or hell, it's terrible to threaten people with hell, but at the same time, if you have in mind that there's a chance that you're going to hell, I would say one of your key pursuits in life would be to make sure you don't end up there. Yeah, so you would try and figure out what constitutes a good life, and good life not in the sense that we are trying to enjoy what we can, but more of how do I be good enough that I can make it to heaven, that kind of good. Yeah, and so that's one of the things. Reincarnation is similar in your actions, because I mean, I would think that the idea of reincarnation is that the better your previous life, the better your...
Yeah, I think it always comes with some form of karmic system.
Correct. Yeah, and I mean, as with most religious ideals, the point is to be a good person. essentially. I mean, it's one of the...
It's trying to shape.
Well, I mean, their definition of a good person.
Correct. Yeah.
I mean, wait, have you heard this story called the egg story of the egg?
No.
It's a guy who wrote
Oh, yeah,
The Martian.
right.
It's about how
That was the Kuz-Kazaa episode, right?
yeah, and how
Oh, okay.
it's
yes,
not about the egg. It's
So
about
you
how
have to
like
live every single human life.
you've lived every single human life, and you are every single thing evil that's happened on this earth,
Yes,
and every
yes,
single good that's happened on this earth.
Remember that
It's
episode?
the idea of infinite possibilities,
blew
lah,
my
I
mind
guess.
when I watched it. Yeah.
I think that's a really good story that
Yeah.
I read.
I remember when I watched the Kuz-Kazaa video, I was like, the twist at the end when they tell you you're actually everybody, I was like,
There's everything everywhere all at once.
yeah. you watch?
Yeah, I
you
just
watch
watched
it?
No idea. I wanted to watch, but like I didn't have any time.
It's good. You should watch it.
I would
I really liked it.
It's a trip, right? It's like a trip movie.
It's quite trippy, but at the same time, bro, it's
Not that
leagues above
trippy,
Multiverse
yeah.
of Madness.
Yeah.
Bruh. Yeah, so I mean, to answer your question, first I want to know how people behave based on that. I mean, okay, let's say a religious person is living his life solely because he doesn't want to disappoint God, let's say, right? And for some reason, he was able to verify in the end that there is no afterlife, that God isn't real, and that nothing you do on this earth has any implication where you go after you die. Will he change his behavior? Will he suddenly say, well, all this time I've been trying to please God, so now that I know God doesn't exist, I'm just going to please myself, essentially. Yeah. You know, is there a difference? And not only for other people, but does it apply to myself as well, you know? Yeah.
Yeah, I think, I don't know, for many religious people, it becomes absolute, right? There's religion or nihilism. I've met very few like, in church you often hear, I think for a lot of people, like, deontological maxims come in contradiction to religion. So a lot of times in church you'll hear, you know, outside utilitarianism, there's very little justification for principled arguments other than some form of religion, other than some form of higher goods. And I suppose that's understandable if you come from a completely religious standpoint, right? If you started from the perspective that there is absolute good in the world, and for some reason the converse were to be made apparent to you, I guess the logical response would be nihilism, right?
Or rather, reasonable response.
Reasonable response.
Have you read Voltaire's Optimism?
No, I haven't. Why?
It's about do you know about the philosophy of optimism?
Yeah, you can explain, maybe.
It's okay. I guess I read I think it was Candide by Voltaire. It was talking about this guy who believed that everything in the world is meant to be good, so he just lives by that principle. While everything around him does not go his way, but he just stumbles through life, like his whole adventure, while just thinking that it just works out, and he just thinks that it's all according to God's plan.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was gonna ask that. Like similar to whatever happens is meant to happen. And
Yeah,
like,
wait. I'll look it up. It's quite interesting.
Well, that's interesting. So that's in contrast, like the other, I guess the alternative narrative to that is, have you read The Stranger?
As in,
By
the-
Albert.
ACS did it for
Camus,
IB,
Yeah,
right?
The
Camus,
outsider.
right?
Yeah,
The outsider.
Correct. Yeah.
I guess it's the reverse of that, right? Should I smoke a cigarette or kill myself?
Yeah.
Where, when you lose this conception of absolute good or a balance of inherent good and evil in the world, then life becomes random and arbitrary.
But I remember that I did look up whether there was a difference between nihilism and absurdism. So absurdism is the key like philosophy or
It was
tenet.
the key tenet of The Stranger.
Yeah, correct. The Stranger, right? And it's not the same as nihilism, but I can't remember what exactly.
Absurdism is reconciling, being a sentient creature living within a cruelly indifferent world, right?
I think it's like accepting the fact that it's meaningless and still
striving to find meaning regardless.
correct, something like that. Whereas nihilism is just giving up, right?
There's no meaning.
Yeah, correct. But I mean, again, when we talk about nihilism, Well, I find it hard to use a non-religious argument against nihilism. It's like me trying to explain to a nihilist why living as a nihilist is bad. There is no ground that I can work on that's similar to his that will.
I mean, I guess I'll say, what is your alternative?
As for
Like,
him.
what is his alternative then? If you are gonna live life by pretending it's meaningless, and just like, I would say you're just being sore about it. Like, I think it's just like overthinking some situations. Like, you don't have to, just because you think, oh yeah, God doesn't exist, it's meaningless, then I should live a meaningful life. Like, there are like things that people enjoy, like hobbies, and like different interests they can pursue. And even though, like, you know, playing golf to the competitive level does not offer any constructive value to the world, but people still pursue it anyway because they find enjoyment in it, and people enjoy watching people play golf. And like, it's meaningless, but it doesn't change the fact that people ultimately still enjoy things they enjoy doing, you know. And like,
Yeah.
it's just the fact that, you know, you're just being how I call it,
Lazy.
it's not an excuse to be lazy, but it's just that it doesn't really click with me, the idea of nihilism.
Yeah, okay. Midway while you were talking, I was gonna ask you, for a nihilist, right? Like, why not? Like, because you said that you would tell the nihilist, you should still pursue that which is meaningful, or at least try to do something, not be lazy. But then, I mean, they could easily respond with why not. But then, as you kept on talking, you talked about specific examples. Then I realized that there is still evidence for meaning, or at least some semblance of meaning. Like when I play a sport, right, and I'm like deeply engaged in it, that's evidence for me that there is, some meaning to be found in anything at all.
But is this merely a human chemical response occurring in our brain? Is it merely a construct, or is this is there inherent meaning to this?
Right. So it's the idea of like reducing the biology essentially, right?
Yeah, do you think it's, purely chemical coercion, right? Do you think you're perceiving meaning, or do you think inherent meaning exists within the world?
That depends on what meaning is. If meaning is defined as the result of biological, like chemical reactions that create your happy feeling or happy sensation from doing something that has meaning, versus like we define meaning as something that's transcendental, like transcends the biology of humans. That in itself is a whole different conversation already. It argues the idea of the existence of the soul, I guess, in a sense.
Yeah.
But that's a whole different rabbit hole, you know.
But actually, to respond to that, I would just raise like Descartes, I think therefore I am, because the mere fact that there is something to be experienced, like tells you that it's above the biological level.
I'll say that even if
Yeah.
the biological aspect exists, like even if that's the case, what does it change? It doesn't change anything that you are still deriving a certain emotion that is considered positive for yourself, and just because it's biological doesn't change the fact that it is good for you by most reasonable means.
But I think to some extent, people think that if it's biological, it's less impressive, or at least it's less, I don't know, transcendental essentially. Like if everything were to be reducible to biology, it seems to me like that's the reason why there's dichotomy between science and religion. It's because people think that if you can explain everything with science, then religion is a phony. It's like if I can explain with bio, God doesn't exist because it's all material, it's all matter. But at least for me, the way I've tried to reconcile it is that God works through his creation, in the sense that the way God affects the world is with the world.
And that is it's like our biology is just the medium in which it occurs.
Yeah, exactly.
That's I think how Thomas Aquinas. He's like this scientist, and he's like
The Catholic
a Catholic priest at the same time. So I was reading a book, and it kind of argues that he argues that the scientific method reconciles with the idea of God and the soul. So it's like, when you use the scientific method, you are experimenting or testing actions, objects, and testing their reactions to prove the validity of a hypothesis or end result, right? So it's like, so whenever I read it said that how a metal detector only detects metals in the sand, but does it disprove the fact that diamonds do not exist in the sand? Just because the metal detector.
So in essence, we don't know what we don't know.
Yes. In a sense, if you argue that the soul doesn't exist because it can't be proven by science, it's simply because there is no way to prove that a soul exists. So it's not that the idea of a soul cannot coexist with the idea of science existing. Simply because there is no empirical way as of yet to determine or value what a soul is.
Yeah, I have to admit it's one of those like unsatisfying cop-out answers, but it's true.
It's a cop-out answer, yeah.
But it's true, yeah. You have to admit that is valid, but just unsatisfying, that's all.
But I found it to be quite an enlightening way of explaining how that these kind of, transcendental concepts can still exist despite the fact that we live in an age where a lot of things are proven with detectors or like methods of analysis.
Yeah, correct.
I find it quite a good explanation that would satisfy some people.
So then, what would your conception of a transcendental meaning to life be, though? It's some notion of either some notion of a higher power or an inherent way to ascertain good or bad, right?
Sorry, what's your question again?
So we're talking about, there has to be more to life, right? Some transcendental form of meaning.
Yes, to combat nihilism, yeah.
Yeah. What would that look like for you, though? Or not necessarily what you believe in, or what's your conception of this?
I personally think that there are multiple levels of transcendental, as in there are more realms than the physical realm, and it's not the physical realm and one other, it's the physical realm and maybe the experiential realm, and then I think math is a realm on its own, like the whole is
Created or discovered.
Yeah, it's math created or discovered, right? And nobody believes that math was
so
created,
back to Descartes and the whole rationalist school of thought.
Yeah, something like that.
Or like how math is just a way for us to better perceive the world.
Yeah.
It's just a realm of a means of existence, it's like a tool.
Correct.
And how we use the specs to see better. Or like, a microscope.
Yeah.
I'll explain it. Something like that. It's a tool in which you perceive the world differently.
Yeah. So that for me, the thing is it's hard to prove with the tools that we have now, which is science, because I feel like science is a two-dimensional tool trying to prove three dimensions. It just feels too limited. Yeah. But the thing is, science has been put on such a high pedestal, and for good reason, that it seems like something like philosophy maybe is not as good of a tool to prove the existence of things.
I find it quite interesting that you said the word feel in your statement there. Like, I think it's very interesting that, like, why would you use the word what made you feel that science is limited in its way it can perceive the world? I'm quite curious about that.
I'd say it's because if you use something in the material world to explore, you will only be able to generate answers within the material world.
Similar is Kant's notion of primary and secondary characteristics, right? Nomina and phenomenon. There are unobservables in the world that science can't explain.
Correct. I mean, it's quite funny. Top 10 questions science still can't explain. But yeah, go ahead.
No, and I mean this idea of unobservables, right? That there are forces at work that are just outside the realm of human perception ever, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, this seems like quite abstract and philosophical and bullshit. But it's true, right? Because higher dimensions do exist, but we struggle to perceive them more than their after effects, right? We can perceive symptoms of them, but we can't actually perceive higher dimensions.
Not only perceive but experiment on.
Experiment,
Yeah.
perceive,
Yeah.
experience.
Correct.
That reminds me of like this idea that something can only be truly divine by the fact that you cannot comprehend it. Because the fact that it is divine means that it's beyond our own realm of understanding. So by nature of it being divine, we just simply cannot understand it, no matter how much we strive towards it.
Okay, but I want to add also that despite this, I do think that even if it's divine, it should still be explainable, just that not comprehensible, if you get what I mean.
Explainable but not comprehensible.
Yeah. So like you can't just make 1 + 1 = 3. Okay. does that make sense? Yeah. I it's like how a concept can be completely logical, just that you don't get it. Yeah. So you can't comprehend the concept,
But the argument exists.
but it works. And it works. Yeah.
okay, so back to rationalism.
Yeah.
Okay, it's just the notion that, what's the argument? That there's a logical structure to reality and we're merely here to perceive it, and we can understand that it works, but not how, or not comprehend how.
Yeah. I mean, to varying degrees, yeah.
There was Locke's proof. I think math was Locke's proof of it. So Locke uses math as proof that our universe and our reality has a logical structure, right? The fact that we can prove things in math,
Yeah.
then we physically cannot experiment with. We can ascertain physical laws using math that we'll never actually be able to experience or perceive in real life.
Kind of link itself to okay, so back to what I was reading. So it was about how we have something called intellectual knowledge, right? So what you were saying, Tim, was like how it transcends over how we perceive the world, right? In a certain sense. So the H2O analogy is like, we know, like our intellectual knowledge knows that liquid, steam, and ice itself, it exists as the same constituents. Like it's H2O, the element, but H2O not the element, the compound. But like you can observe that under different temperature conditions, ice reverts back to water, steam reverts back to water through the transfer of heat. But this process of understanding is non-material in itself. It transcends the idea of the material sense.
The process of understanding.
How so?
Okay, would you say that if you were only a material being, you could only be united with things in only a material way?
United as in I can only
Be conjoined with things in a material way?
What's conjoined?
yes,
though?
okay,
Like
I get
touch physically.
No, more like have a relationship, whatever.
Also interact with.
Yes, because if you
Yes.
were a purely material being, you could only have a relationship with things in a material way. But if the idea of intellectual knowledge transcending your material senses exists, you cannot be a purely material being, because you can only have non-material unity with the fact that knowledge, the existence of knowledge.
So it's kind of like, it's epistemology, right? The fact that we can know things that we can't
Inference.
experience with sense perception.
Yeah.
Inference, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm kind of butchering the explanation of it, but I think this was really something I read when I was reading about Thomas Aquinas and how he tried to rationalize the idea between science and existence of religion and God itself. I think that's really interesting.
Interesting. So the idea of us being intellectual beings, inherent knowledge, and then we can get into the whole poverty of stimulus argument and stuff like that. Wait, but how? Okay, this seems kind of cliched for this kind of discussion, but how did we get here? Like, how does this relate to the conception of a good life or the conception of how we react?
I guess we were just talking about, like, we talked about like nihilism, and then we talked about meaning, and then whether meaning exists, and how to prove that meaning exists. That's why we ended up on biology and how to and the material and non-material. Yeah, that's where we ended up.
Okay, so what's the implication of rationalism on meaning if we're beings that exist beyond a physical plane and we exist as intellects and we can perceive the logical structure of the universe and we have inherent knowledge and stuff like that. What's then the impact of that or the implication of that on our conception of meaning in a good life?
Oh, I mean, I thought, or at least it was quite evident to me that if you can prove that there is meaning beyond the material world, then nihilism should be quite easily invalid.
But why does rationalism lead to meaning? Like, you can still contemplate things beyond a physical plane, and there can still be existence at a higher level than just biology, but things can still be meaningless, right?
But is that not the meaning of meaning? Like, okay, maybe my definition of meaning is different from yours, but when I think about meaning, I think about interactions at a plane that is beyond physical. Yeah.
The abstract meaning. You're I guess you're trying to say that there's an absolute ideal of abstract idea of that a meaning exists for every single human. That a single concept of a meaningful life exists for every one of us, no matter how different we are.
Yeah, I mean, a meaningful life doesn't have to look exactly the same, but
there's an abstract notion of it that exists
correct.
somewhere.
Yeah.
But just because we can exist in the abstract, it's unclear to me what the link to meaning is. The ability to think in abstract and understand that something exists, you can interact with things beyond just a physical level, right? On planes higher than a physical.
Okay, I get your.
It's unclear what the relation to meaning is for me because it still stands to reason that you can understand all these things, right? You can understand that, you are able to contemplate interactions on a higher plane and you're not just the sum total of your parts and matter and energy. And life can still be meaningless, right?
Okay, then I will ask what your definition of meaning is.
Yeah, I guess that's the question that still stands because playing the devil's advocate, after that whole rationalist argument and establishing that, we can exist as beings that are more than just the sum of our parts, right? I still think a nihilist would say, so what? What is the so what?
It's a cop-out, right? Isn't it? Kind of a so what itself.
I guess no, because then I would simply ask the nihilist, what is he looking for? Then, look, if you're gonna posit that there is no meaning, then there has to be. You have to give me something I can point to you that is meaning. So, what would be your definition of meaning? Yeah, I mean, I'm not trying to grill you, but yeah, I'm just curious to know if you don't see that transcendental concepts are meaning in of themselves, then what exactly constitutes meaning to you?
Fair enough. I do think meaning involves more than just this idea of transcendentalism, even though it's a key component of it. I do think it also brings in an ethical debate, right? Because transcendentalism isn't prescriptive. It doesn't tell you what you should do with your life. And I do think that meaning requires a certain prescriptive nature, right?
Wow, okay. No, I would disagree. Because okay, look, for me, when I think about doing something meaningful, think about something that I am deeply engaged with, something that it's akin to when I forget about the troubles that are at hand, and I'm focused and I am engaged into the thing, and that's a meaningful experience for me. And so that's not something that's not something that I what's the word for it, that I prescribe for myself. It's something that you could even say that it emerged from within me. if you get what I mean. Yeah.
But I mean, I do think at some fundamental level, it does belie a principle that is fundamentally prescriptive, right? The principle is that you want to create something or you want to do something that brings you meaning in this whatever sense, and that more meaning is better than no meaning. But just contemplating it itself doesn't satisfy this principle, right? Just being able to contemplate these things doesn't in itself bring meaning to you, right? And I think it's really hard to talk about it in abstract. But it's like saying, just because you're able to contemplate what things would bring you joy or what things would bring you fulfillment doesn't bring fulfillment in itself, right? Because the underlying principle is you have to do these things and you have to do more of these things, and that's prescriptive, right? And it sounds like kind of a cop-out, but that's just to establish that there is some form of principle at play, however vague it is, which is still prescriptive. You want to do more of whatever you decide is fulfilling rather than just existing and perceiving it. And that's at its very base level, right?
I mean, because a meaningful life cannot be derived by simply talking about what a meaningful life should be, but in the fact that you must act and in conduct with the principles which you define what a meaningful life is.
Yeah, so I
All this
think...
talk is meaningless if you don't practice, you don't act in the way you believe how a meaningful life should be.
Yeah, so I do think we've arrived at an interesting question, right? Whatever your conception of a meaningful life is it prescriptive?
Well, I guess the only answer that I have to that is that it is I am somehow intrinsically motivated to pursue this meaning. Yeah, it's I guess I don't really have an explanation for why we crave meaningful experiences. But
Right. So then that was leading me to, so do you think a conception of meaning is then contingent on a belief in the existence of good and evil? Not necessarily good and... I think these are very stark, opaque terms we can discuss. It can be construed however you like, but the idea of objectivity, the idea that an objective good exists, and the idea that something, that objective moral or ethical standards or whatever standards exist that you can aspire towards. Do you think these standards, do you think you first have to agree on the premise of these standards to then believe that there's inherent meaning to life? Or can it exist in the absence of these standards? Because then I think those are what I think the two components of meaning are. The acceptance of the premise that there are objectives and standards, there are objective standards in existence, be it good or evil or whatever your conception of these objective standards are, and your idea of transcendentalism and the ability to perceive more than the physical plane and stuff like that.
I understand where you were leading to now. Yeah, and it's okay. That's why you were trying to stress that whatever I was talking about is rationalist, right? And
like, I think it's a necessary condition but not a sufficient condition.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, right now, the only way I can answer, or rather try and formulate an answer, is if I can ask myself whether, if there is no such thing as good and evil, can there still be meaning? But the thing is, when I refer back to being engaged in my sports, for example, that's not necessarily a good or evil thing. It's just a thing.
It's neutral.
Yeah, correct. It's neutral. I mean,
Entirely neutral.
yeah.
But then, I guess, okay, it's whether you delve into this idea of, two things again. Am I just enjoying this sport at a purely physical and biological level? Or two, again, is there something transcendental? Am I perceiving this experience of sports more than purely just a physical experience? And if the latter is true, then what about this more than physical experience am I appreciating?
Yes, okay.
Is it the sense of camaraderie? which then would be a sense of objective good. A sense of camaraderie is better than no sense of camaraderie. Is it the sense of competitiveness, getting ahead in life, and a sense of progression is better than no progression?
Okay, yes.
Because if then your conception of life would be all these things are absolutely meaningless, then sports kind of seems arbitrary and useless, right?
Yeah. Even if it evokes that kind of...
Even if it evokes that
yeah,
kind of
okay,
physical
okay.
response. Or if you say, I'm purely enjoying it at a physical level, then that's something quite easy to accept, right? But then are you just enjoying the dopamine and not actually finding meaning in it?
Yeah, I mean, to put it into terms, I'll ask you, what would it change if you found out that none of that, if it was simply purely created the dopamine in your head? Would it change? Would it make you not play sports anymore? What would you do?
Yeah, I don't think it would deter me from...
You wouldn't care, right? You would just continue doing it.
Okay, I think to extend your question, right, it could be something like if the ethical realm didn't exist, but the experiential realm still did.
Yeah, exactly.
Is it
Can there be
meaningless?
meaning?
Okay.
Or would we just be, intelligences floating around for no apparent reason? And oftentimes, right, I think that's, like, you see, I mean, I think this is oversimplifying the equation, but you hear, I think this is what happens. People often talk about the curse of high intellect. And it often is brought about because issues become more complex and more grey, and things no longer seem black and white, but you're still able to perceive things at a high level, and in fact, an even higher level, right? And ironically, life becomes more and more, well, some studies show life becomes more and more inherently meaningless the more intelligent you get, because you can perceive more things on an experiential plane, but conversely, morality becomes more and more grey. And then you just seem to be an intelligence existing for the sake of intelligence with no inherent meaning. I don't know, I think that's an apt example, like the intelligence paradox.
Like ignorance is bliss kind of.
Yeah,
right?
almost. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm still inclined to believe that meaning exists without the ethical realm. It's no longer an ethical form of meaning, I guess. Yeah, I still think that our definition of meaning is different, and maybe it's time for me to change what I mean by meaning. But yeah, when I okay, like let's say we take the literal definition of meaning, as in like giving something. Wow, what's a synonym for meaning?
It's but you create it, right? Isn't it
Yeah.
the fact that
I mean,
it's
it's a
created?
construct.
Not, I mean, regardless of whether it's a construct or not, it exists beyond the physical realm. Yeah, I see food maybe not sorry, not food. Okay, let's say I see a lion, not as a lion, but as danger. And the fact that I perceive it as danger means that I give it some form of meaning. And you don't have to think about it in ethical terms, because danger is I could easily just say like
It's just self-preservation.
yeah, correct. I could easily
Oh, okay, I
replace
see. Okay, yeah, I do think we
So-
have different
so-
different meanings for meaning.
So if I can abstract something above the material realm, for me that's giving something meaning. And now I see that it's not as it seems too okay. I'm not using the same definition of meaning, let's say, as what.
So what I'm thinking of is like meaning to life, right? Like if you were to boil it down, it's like an imperative you live for.
Okay.
If you do want to posit that the universe, there is some rhyme and reason to the universe, and it isn't just arbitrary randomness, and what you're doing isn't just arbitrary randomness.
Okay, then I think yours would be akin to a purpose.
Principle based.
Yeah, something like it fulfills a certain purpose that was assigned to you, that is apart from you, that is not. Yeah, is that, am I getting that right?
Yeah, but yeah, no, I mean that's what I thought we were discussing, but I'm curious, how How does your concept of what relation does your concept of meaning have to like existentialism though? Because that was like our starting point.
Yeah. Okay, perhaps my definition of meaning was slightly. It's like an amalgamation of whatever you're referring to and whatever I was referring to. Yeah. So, and maybe to some extent I was confusing the two because they're all transcendental, so I just lumped them into one heap. But yeah, now that we split the two.
So meaning as in an imperative in life, and meaning
Yes.
as the ability to experience things in abstract terms.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Then
Focus on the first, right?
yes.
It's more practicable to
Mm.
do so. You know.
Okay, yeah. Then in that case, I agree with you that if there is no ethical realm, then it's still meaningless. Because then you have no unit of measurement for what you should be pursuing. Yeah. Yeah.
But
Yes.
would you think there is a need for measurement? Would you think that there needs to even if it even needs to exist in the first place?
I think it's necessary for direction, I guess. Yeah, so you could say that these kinds of things surface on their own. Value in of itself is something that precipitates from our daily lives. Like, we don't even have to be talking of religious terms. Let's say body standards, for example. That's a value system that we impose on ourselves, a goal that we strive towards, a direction that we try to hit towards, and any action that takes you in that direction is an ethical meaning to you.
Right, yeah.
Is that right? Yeah.
Maybe not even ethical, but I guess principle.
Okay, yes. Principle meaning, yeah. So, in that sense, I think yes, it's necessary to have this kind of direction-based approach. Not only because I think it's good for us, but I think because it surfaces naturally on its own. Yeah, like I mean, us as humans, we inevitably create values for ourselves. Yeah. So I mean, that alone is, I think, enough for me to conclude that having a goal to strive towards is important. Yeah. Okay, this ties up relatively nicely with mortality, because at the end of the day, we are creatures that crave fulfillment in terms of heading towards a goal. Then the mere fact that mortality is built into ourselves means that there is a finite amount of time to achieve that goal that we would like, or at least to progress further on that goal. If you had infinite number of days to get into beach board, then I mean, I just wait like 500 years and then do it. But if I had 60 days left to do it, let's say after 60 days I could never get a beach board again, then that's
You will struggle with all your might to
Yeah,
achieve it
correct.
because you want it.
yeah, and because I don't have enough time to do it.
Yeah, so I think, yeah, it's back to that idea of lightness, right? It's the fleetingness of things that give it meaning.
Correct. Yeah.
Like, say you had the choice over and over again, should I get a beach board? Eventually it'll become meaningless, right? It's like, why? Why bother? It's
Yeah,
all
that's true.
arbitrary if you keep doing it over and over again, right? Infinite times. Where you have the opportunity to summer glow up an infinite number of times.
Is there anything that exists that still has meaning even though you do it infinite amount of times? Was there like a little caveat that Nietzsche added? No. So it means that everything that exists will become meaningless if you have this infinite.
I think that's why he posits. The original text was German
Oh, okay.
and extremely difficultly worded.
Yeah, Nietzsche's
So I think
pain.
this whole idea was something very relevant to like this book I read last year, and I just reread so that I could like discuss this whole thing. It's like, have you heard of this book called Man's Search for Meaning?
Viktor Frankl.
Yeah, have you read it?
No, I didn't. But yeah, it's quite. It comes out quite often.
In most books discussing meaning itself, right?
Or conversations. Yeah. What about it?
Do you read it?
No, I haven't read it.
It's actually a really, really good read. Like, actually, I found it to be how I call it. He used his experience in a concentration camp in like as a Jew to justify the fact that because even though all these prisoners lived lives of absolute suffering, they still found meaning in every action they did, be it through suffering or through living each day, because every time they suffered, it was for a purpose, you know, and every action they took in their time in the camp had purpose and meaning to it, you know. Okay, thanks.
Okay, yeah. So it's the idea of purpose, right? And I think it's related to the fact that meaning has to be related to purpose, and in some sense, if you take it on a religious scale, then God-given purpose is the most meaningful thing you can pursue.
From the point of a religious person.
Yeah, correct, yeah. Which is why sometimes if there is no God, then nihilism is what follows, because now there is no such thing as purpose, so now there is no such thing as meaning. Yeah.
It's like how like people often say, tell atheists, you know, if God doesn't exist, why don't you just do absolute evil stuff?
Or why don't you just kill yourself right now?
Like, aren't you still acting in the situation? Aren't you acting morally if in the existence that God might still exist? That's why you're acting morally. If not, what's holding you back from doing the most absolutely vile or evil thing that you wanted to do? Exact your own actions just because you seek them.
And I mean it's a question you have to ask yourself. If you assume that there is no God, you know, like, what reason do I have to continue doing that which is good? Yeah. I mean, there's no reason, lah. But you know,
I do think if there's no conception of religion, I do think there's very little reason to do good. I mean, you can argue like economic and game theoretic approaches, like diminishing marginal returns and all of that. But I think philosophically, like, the most you can strive to be is morally neutral, and you can justify that, I think. Like, if you take the deontological principle, right? You guys are familiar with Kant's deontological principle, right?
Are you able to summarize it?
So any axiom has to be universal. Things have to be universal. So why can't we do genocide? We can't do genocide because you can't universally do genocide.
Wait, what? Wait, okay.
Every axiom, in order to be justifiable, that's essentially, if you reduce it a lot, it's Kant's deontological
Okay.
maxim. It's that any axiom or any, principle must be able to be applied universally to be deemed justifiable. And in that sense, it precludes things. It tells you what not to do, right? You can't do things that are unsustainable universally. So that's why killing is not good, because not everyone can kill. But it doesn't preclude good deeds. It doesn't say you should do good deeds, which is what people often misconstrue with deontology. It doesn't say you should do good deeds, but good deeds as an axiom can be applied universally, right? It would work if you say everyone should be nice to your neighbor, but it would not work if you said everyone should steal and pilfer from your neighbor. So I think it's possible philosophically to justify being morally neutral and not doing bad things.
Based on the deontological principle.
The answer would just be doing nothing.
But I don't think you can justify. Well, no, you do morally neutral things, or don't do morally bad things.
What is doing a morally neutral thing?
Well, many things are morally neutral, right? I mean, you can extrapolate to infinity, but
This is morally neutral.
drinking water is morally neutral. Existing is morally neutral. Learning is morally neutral.
Right.
That is new.
Making money
You are
for
not-
yourself is
You
morally
are not
neutral.
making a decision. It is a new decision because it has no impact. Like, I mean, yeah, drinking water has impact in the fact that not drinking water will make you die in 3 days or 4 days.
Okay, actually that's a good point.
But the apathy itself is a form of death. The neutrality that arises from not deciding to take a stance, be it good or bad, results in you having not done anything.
But it doesn't say you can't do good. It doesn't oblige you to do good. Because I do think it's very hard to justify good. A non-utilitarian approach to doing good outside religion.
But you're not choosing to do bad either. You're not choosing to do anything else.
No, but the deontological principle precludes doing bad, right? It says, well, I mean, what it identifies as bad. It identifies what's morally negative.
Okay, but I feel like with this deontology,
I mean, this is just one example, but it's just the idea that I think you can have some form of a conception of good and evil outside religion, right?
I mean, okay,
A principle
I
just
know that Sam Harris tries to create a moral system outside of religion. He's one of the champions of ethics without religion. Yeah, because he likes to argue that the main argument against atheism is nihilism, but he says that's not true. You can still create your own values. So I'm completely butchering this, but his entire basis is human welfare, as in
So you-
flourishing, life.
so it's a utilitarian approach.
Yes, I would say some similar to that. Yeah, and so he says that you can take a look at a set of actions that would promote human life, and then take a look at a set of actions that don't, and then okay, I'm completely butchering this.
Interesting, but if you use
yeah.
this human welfare and human life approach, right? I do think there's very little justification for it because the underlying assumption is that human life is good.
But you can always take
Why
a
is life
Darwin-
better than
you
no
can
life?
take a Darwinian approach to it, which is that if you don't put life as the single most important like the maxim, then things cease to exist, and you just, and that's it. Like you can't even be around to discuss this anymore. Yeah.
But why does perceiving it? I mean, it's that whole is if a tree falls down in the forest, right?
Yeah, correct.
Why does having to perceive it make it the fundamental premise? Life needs to exist for the discussion to take place, the physical discussion to take place, and for intelligent beings to comprehend it, right? But it doesn't mean that these ethical considerations don't exist independently of life.
Yeah, that's true. I don't have a good counter argument for that. If I read a bit more Sam Harris, maybe I would, but yeah, I can't really defend his position well. Yeah.
I mean, I do think there are some principled justifications to a conception of good and bad outside religion. It's also, I mean, the harm principle is also one, right? Maximizing pain, maximizing pleasure, minimizing pain.
Yeah.
Like that also leads to some form of conception of good or evil, right?
That's true.
Even though it can get warped at times because it's value judgment free.
Then in that case, the really the only way out of it is which one is more true, essentially. And well, it's just the way you prove that is not by talking about these things. Yeah.
I mean, to ground,
yeah.
I'll say you have to ultimately ground it in reality, or isn't it? Like, all these are proven by your actions and your decisions, and that's what matters the most, doesn't it? I feel like all these ideas exist as different ways for people to justify certain means of living, while not objectively right or wrong in any sense or purpose. Well, to a certain extent, can't be objectively right or wrong, it still exists, and people choose to live their lives based on these ideas or precepts. You know, there's no wrong in that. You know,
Yeah.
but I mean, doesn't some I mean some ideas of what people find meaning is the meaning of people, of the idea of love, right? You find meaning by your love for a partner, your family, or like your friends. That is where you can find meaning, and your decisions that help show your love, or the idea that these help you express your love is a form of meaning that a lot of people use, do, and conduct
Yeah.
in the course of their actions of their lives.
Interesting. So it goes back to Ben's idea of obligation, because I think at the most fundamental level, love is an obligation, right? Do you think love can exist outside obligation?
Or wouldn't the idea that of love being obligation makes it kind of transactional? You're obligated
I
to
think it does make it, well,
you
or maybe not obligation, duty. Obligation's a poor
or is it
phrase.
impulse? An impulse you want, or like
I do think part and parcel of love is a sense of duty, right?
No, I think it's
duty exists as a result of love.
Yes, I was gonna say that.
That's what I'm thinking. You have duty. You are, these are means of express. There are different ways of expressing the idea of love.
Yeah, correct. They are manifestations of love.
Yeah.
rather than-
You are dutiful and loyal to your spouse because you want to show that your love extends to her and her only.
Maybe not even show lah, but that it actually does. Like
Yeah.
Yeah. So oh yeah, love is a different dimension, man.
Interstellar.
Yeah, actually I just recently rewatched it.
I mean, back to what I was talking about by Victor's book about what Victor wrote in Man's Search for Meaning. It's about how a person should act as if it's their second chance to live their life. So whatever action they regretted in the past, or they think they regret doing or not having done, they should act according to those maxims in the present and in the future. Does
Like
that
the
really make
feeling of
sense?
the feeling of regret, is it?
That when deciding how to base your life around these meanings, we should base it on the fact that if I were not give it a second chance, will I regret it or not? By that sole impulse in itself alone, would I regret it if I did this decision? For example, right now, if I were to go home and start playing Elden Ring for the next 3 hours and give up on sleep, I would wake up the next day. I couldn't be tired and might just like be late for a meeting with a friend. If that causes me regret, if I had a second chance, would I do it again? So structuring a life around these meanings can help propel how you act in the future, you know. Not sure if that's the correct analogy.
He uses that as a kind of principle for you to act on, is it?
You're always given a question on how you want to act, and you must follow up with an answer in the form of conduct and your actions
Right.
that proves that validates your consistent meaning.
Right, and I think it's similar to what I think it's Socrates said, that the way he lives was just he would just listen to his conscience. Like it's if he felt his conscience saying that he shouldn't do it, he just wouldn't do it. And I know there are like 1,001 times that
To disprove that or argue against it, right?
Yeah. So ways of living, I guess.
It's interesting. There are also many arguments. I mean, what is consciousness, right? Well, not consciousness, but what is your conscience? Like, I was reading an article recently. There's a school of thought that believes that human consciousness is an evolutionary feature that only evolved recently in the last 2,000 or so years.
Okay.
And to preface this idea, consciousness is the idea of internal dialogue, right? The idea that you can contemplate multiple opinions, or you don't have to act on instinct, right?
Abstract thought. Is that-
Abstract. Well, not necessarily abstract thought. I do think it can be an independent concept from abstract thought. But it's this idea of internal dialogue and and self-awareness
Okay.
of what your action and being able to consider your actions and stuff like that, right? And it's interesting because the argument goes, and I can't remember who made the argument exactly, but it's a school of thought that human consciousness actually developed recently, and the evidence they use, the anthropological evidence they use for this, is that oftentimes in the past, what we would now describe as our own consciousness and internal dialogue, people described as divine inspiration from the gods and stuff like that. And in literature and anthropological and archaeological evidence, the idea of internal dialogue and conflict with oneself and the ability to contemplate actions only surfaced more recently. So if it's an evolutionary feature, then back to the Socratic idea of just listening to your consciousness, is that in itself arbitrary? Is it just a reflection of our biology?
The very last thing, just to wrap up this, was just a fun question, which is, which one would you choose? As in, which kind of afterlife you would choose if you had to choose? Yeah. Okay, this being no afterlife, heaven or hell, reincarnation, or the infinite thing.
I think I'd rule out reincarnation because I dislike this idea of a karmic system because I think humans are fundamentally flawed. And I mean, maybe it's my Christian sensibilities, but I like the idea of grace lah. Because I think it's impossible for humans to strive to the ethical ideals we set out for ourselves. And if we're living by a karmic system, we're just gonna fall short woefully. And then live life as a pig.
Oh yeah.
I don't know, cause like I wouldn't consider myself like heavily religious. So like honestly, the idea of afterlife is like pretty neutral. Cause I would consider that the fact that me right now, while I'm still alive, I'm not really gonna consider, because if the effect of heaven or hell doesn't really faze me, then I'm more concerned of how I'm willing to live my current life right now. But you know, if I had to choose, probably reincarnation, because if I could relive a different life with not 100% memory of what I lived in this life, but with certain knowledge and maturity, I think it's even if I didn't remember, I think it's the most, I'll say, it just appeals to me the most, I guess. You know.
I think it stems from the fact that maybe this life right now is the most vibrant, maybe. Do you think?
What do you mean by this life is the most vibrant?
As in for him, I don't know. That's my guess. Yeah.
Most vibrant.
It's like if your preferred afterlife is reincarnation back here, with limited foreknowledge. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It seems like you would treasure this world more.
I mean, yeah, I guess, because like I'm kind of enjoying like watching Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul back to back right now. You know, like as shallow as all these random things may be, they still add up to like certain enjoyment and satisfaction you glean from them. Like,
Oh, is it the Rick and Morty quote? Life has no meaning, everything is useless. Just come inside and watch some TV.
Vaguely recall that. Yeah. Okay, well, for me, wow. You see, the thing is, everybody wants to go to heaven, nobody wants to go to hell. The unfortunate thing is you have to accept that. If you accept one, you have to accept the other. And therefore the potential of going to one or the other. But wow, that being said, part of me wants there to be no afterlife, just so that
You don't
Actually,
have to,
I
you
feel
don't
that-
have to bear the responsibility of your actions.
I don't know. No,
Not
I don't know if
really-
it's
not
my
really.
human sensibility, but anything for infinity just seems
Yeah.
terrifying to me. Even if it's, perfection for infinity.
Still-
Anything to infinity seems
yeah.
meaningless. Like Nietzsche's idea of weight, right?
If heaven is internal, it is quite dystopian, right? Nothing changes.
Yeah, correct.
It is just endlessly perfect.
It's also confusing to me how you could
Enjoy it.
How can
Yeah.
utopia exist in endless blessing? How is
Yeah.
maybe it's because it's
And I guess-
divine, which is why we can't
I
perceive
guess
it.
it's the limitation. It's probably
Our mind's
again an
limitation.
issue of the limitations of human perception.
with our
right?
current logic. It does seem like
Yeah, but within
you-
my current frame of reference, it is
Yeah.
quite a terrifying
like
prospect.
if I let you eat cakes forever, at some point you get bored of the cakes.
But if it was truly a heaven, you wouldn't even know. You wouldn't even get bored of it in the
Yeah.
first place because you wouldn't have the capacity in that sense to.
Maybe you have
To understand.
You have an
Like-
infinite number of cakes to
Think
satisfy.
about your favorite activity now.
Hmm.
What would you say your favorite activity now is?
But every time your favorite activity starts getting boring, you immediately get into the next activity
Maybe.
in heaven,
Yeah, I think it's
But like
possible.
eating a steak for infinity seems as monotonous to me as being Sisyphus and rolling a ball up the slope. Like
But that wouldn't be heaven.
as you
already.
tend towards
Yeah,
infinity, it
correct.
seems identical.
But then you could easily just say that, let's say I were immortal, for example. That's life on this earth for infinity, and
And Wolverine just wants to kill himself.
well, Wolverine wants to kill himself pretty much all the time, I think. But yeah, I think you can have an endless amount of novelty in heaven. Yeah.
Because that's what it's designed to be,
Yeah.
And because like the concept of it would just be eradicated perhaps in our minds the moment we don't if it exists.
Well, but that scares me. That's the real one that scares me. The fact that
It enforces that on you.
that you're kind of you lose a certain part of free will in some sense. Like you are now tricked to think that everything is good.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know. Yeah.
It's a perfect utopia.
Which goes to standard of meaning, right?
But utopia shouldn't
If-
exist.
If there's no longer, if evil is eradicated and there's no longer
Yeah.
a sense of good and evil, is there meaning?
Yeah, exactly. And it's like humans crave challenge, So if there is no such thing as loss, then there is no such
Well,
thing
you
as
have never loved.
there's such thing as gain. The idea of heaven actually to some extent is paradoxical. Yeah. Yeah. It scares me because it's just that it doesn't seem to be able to exist in my mind. Yeah.
Which maybe is the point. It is what we can't comprehend.
Therefore it is heaven. It is divine.
And any conception that we can have of heaven would fall short of what heaven is.
Yeah.
Because we are not meant to perceive heaven. Else we would be God.
Yeah.
If I could tell you right now what heaven would be, then that would make me God, and therefore not make me one of you.
Which
What
makes
heaven
sense,
is.
right?
It makes sense. It makes sense.
If we could come up with what heaven was, then we just try and create it. But obviously we
That's
can't,
true,
right?
That's true.
That's why, like, whenever we try to create heaven on earth, it always falls short.
It's Xavier's idea of the metal detector, right? Like, we don't know what the diamond is. And our metal detectors
I mean,
can't try
It's
and
like-
emulate that.
the Tower of Babel is one of it, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's
and
because when they try to create the perfect place, the Tower of Babel itself, God cast away everyone to different parts of the world.
Yeah.
The perfect utopia cannot exist.
Yeah, and he made racism.
The CEO, he is the CEO.
Yeah. Okay, I think that's a fitting place to end.